local heritage list and non-designated heritage assets. So just quickly, if I can start getting the slides working. There we go. So who am I and why am I talking to you? So I'm from the South Yorkshire Archaeology Service. We are the local authority archaeological advisors for Sheffield, Rotherham, Barnsley and Doncaster. So we provide development management advice. We also set standards for archaeological work in our area and approve WSIs, that sort of thing. We work with researchers and we maintain the historic environment record, but we also run the South Yorkshire Local Heritage List project, which I have 1 day a week to spend on, which isn't enough, but we'll get into that. So this is what I'm hoping to talk to you about, unless I get too sidetracked, which the slides are here to keep me on track. So heritage assets, what are they? Identifying non-designated heritage assets. What is the local heritage list? Policy background and implementation, just to kind of say where local listing fits into the policy side of things, and then hopefully time for a couple of in-depth examples and then some Q&A. So we're all familiar with MPPF, I'd imagine. So obviously we all know two principal forms of heritage asset, designated and non-designated. I'm not going to talk about designated, but hopefully we all know about listed buildings and scheduled monuments. So we're just going to concentrate on the non-designated heritage assets. So what are non-designated heritage assets? So there is a definition in the National Planning Policy Practice Guidance, and this tells us that non-designated heritage assets can be buildings, monuments, sites, places, areas or landscapes that they are identified by plan-making bodies, that they have a degree of significance meriting consideration in planning decisions. So a note, that building can mean a lot of things. And obviously, if you think about a listed building, a milestone can be a listed building, a water pump can be a listed building. So building is a built structure of some kind. So it's very inclusive. So this is the way that we identify them. So we have the local heritage list, which we'll go into. So this is sort of bottom up. This is local nominations, certainly in South Yorkshire. There are other areas will have a different approach, and in some instances it may be more led by the local authority. In South Yorkshire, I'd say 90 to 99% of our applications are from members of the public. There's local and neighbourhood plans. So these are obviously come from a sort of a separate planning route, but they may include local lists. Conservation area appraisals and reviews, the detailed documents that you might get, which identify what makes a place valuable. And then, of course, decision making. So these are, as it said on the previous slide, things which are identified by a plan-making body. However, that doesn't underplay the role that everybody takes as the consultants and specialists who advise applicants on these things. That information is obviously reviewed by the local planning authority. They may make the ultimate decision as to whether or not they consider it a non-designated heritage asset, but it's this collective investigation of the site that identifies the heritage interests and what might be worth considering, what has that degree of significance meriting consideration. And it's important to note that these things aren't mutually just exclusive. Local lists, neighbourhood plan lists and conservation areas can all overlap, and so you could have the same asset nominated 3 times, and that is partly a problem with the way that these systems work. There isn't an overarching system for identifying non-designated heritage assets. So yeah, you do have to kind of dig in sometimes to find these things, but also don't get too upset if you find the fact that you find the same thing locally listed 3 times. So local lists. So for these regional local lists, like the South Yorkshire local list, they are usually found on council websites. The one for South Yorkshire you can view them through each of the websites of Rotherham, Barnsley, Doncaster and Sheffield, normally on the conservation pages that you get to. We in South Yorkshire have an overarching web page which sort of pulls all those decisions that are made on the local level together and presents them on one map with all the information that we've used for assessing those in terms of, to determine their significance. They may also be included on the local HER. They are in South Yorkshire. But again, whilst everyone wants them to be on their HER, it's a resourcing issue. So in some areas, they may not have it. So it is difficult. You still need to double check. So if you're asking for your HER searches, you can ask for local list information. They may be able to provide it, or they may be able to say, well, you can find it here. Neighbourhood local lists are harder to find. They are also often on the council web pages. And you might need to go into the neighbourhood plan document to find a list. And sometimes it is just a list. It will just name the buildings. Sometimes it's a name and a plan. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you also get a little assessment form that they've used, which may say why they think it's interesting. Sometimes that's in a separate document. Again, they can be in HERs, but they're not usually. Neighbourhood plans, for whatever reason, move in a separate track to normal planning activities, and HERs haven't traditionally picked up on these, partly because neighbourhood plans don't have a great deal of oversight from the people who manage the HERs. They sort of go about doing it themselves. So there's sometimes questions about their robustness. But anyway, we can come back to that. So when we're talking about identifying them from conservation area appraisals, we read one of these, they often call these buildings different things. I think on these two examples, we've got positive contributors and buildings of historic interest being coloured in on the map, which were technically non-designated heritage assets, but which contribute to a designated heritage asset, the conservation area. It's important to remember, again, that we're not just talking about buildings. Whilst the plans often identify only the buildings, if you look through the document, it will be telling you that the walls add to the character, the lampposts add to the character, the way in which it's been laid out adds to the character. So other aspects of the area may also be non-designated heritage assets. And then finally, identifying non-designated heritage assets during the planning assessment stage. So it may be flagged by the local planning authority that there's a potential heritage asset here, or one that they've got from the information through the HER or from the officers, or it may be flagged actually by the applicants or by a consultant, someone who's a member of the public, or a amenity group who have consulted on the application and flagged that there might be something there. In any one of these routes, the local planning authority can request a heritage statement, and I won't go into detail on these because that's another topic really, one which would take as long to talk about as this. But obviously we use in producing these, and just a quick list, we use appropriate experience, we consult the historic environment record, there's pre-app consultation to identify heritage constraints, and often it's worth asking the people who's made the recommendation from the LPA what they want in terms of a brief for additional research, and obviously in regards to archaeology, below ground archaeology, field evaluation might be required. And then obviously the ultimate aim is to produce this, demonstrate this understanding of significance and assess the impact through a formal report. So let's now focus in on what my main topic is here, the local heritage list. So what is a local heritage list? So I've got a number of points here. I won't read them to you, but essentially it's this idea that we're giving people the opportunity to identify things within their environment which they believe have value for the local character, distinctiveness, history, all of these criteria. But also it's not just a means of identifying those and celebrating them, it also allows them to be taken into consideration in planning decisions from a much earlier stage. If we know about them, then we can manage them. How do we assess these nominations? So obviously Historic England have their own guidance on local heritage listing, which is currently under review. I can't imagine that the general criteria are going to change too much. So age, rarity, architectural and artistic interest, archaeological interest, historic interest, including social and communal value, landmark status, and group value. in South Yorkshire, and I can't remember if it's in the guidance or not, it might actually, I think it actually is, that there are sort of a bespoke set of criteria for different categories of non-designated heritage asset, which sort of tailor them a little. In South Yorkshire, we've tailored it again another stage just to make sure that it's picking up, that the criteria pick up on local themes. But let's have a look at these criteria in a lot more detail. So age, rarity, and historic interest, it should say there really. So that's the first edition OS, and the traditional cutoff that you see in listing, where they say buildings predating 1850 are more likely to be eligible for listing. The same occurs with local listing, that if you have a building which is on the first edition OS, then it meets the criteria or for age. Doesn't mean that later buildings can't be, though. If they're of merit, certainly where they relate to things like emerging municipal identities, local industries, and important developments in communities. Then obviously rarity, which can be unusual or rare survivals. This is a bit unfair, these examples, because both of these are listed, nationally listed, but they demonstrate what I'm talking about, things which are unusual in their design potentially, or rare in their survival. But then also illustrative of historic, of the history of the area. And that can include the fact that they can still contain features which tell you how these buildings were used. They may be that they're particular historic stories or people associated with those, or they may be associated with particular pivotal events like this air raid shelter sign. So architecture, and obviously we start off with saying, well, what makes an area distinctive is its traditional vernacular. Buildings which demonstrate and preserve that are going to be considered to be of interest, but not just the traditional vernacular. Certainly when we get into sort of like the more national industrial vernacular, it can be these Victorian and Edwardian buildings which are distinctive and add to the character of the area. Also, it's important to identify whether they're by a known architect. It's not always possible to establish this, but it does add interest because it puts it within a body of work at that point. And also you can associate it, you can determine, is this someone who's had a large influence on the design and character of an area? Modern buildings, and obviously I said it's not just these historic ones, it can be things like this Burton's, where they are built to a national template, but they have a very strong presence and they date and a distinctive age when within the townscape. So they have value, even though they're modern. And then more broadly, and these aren't locally listed in Sheffield, but I put them up as a discussion point potentially, is airy houses. So prefab houses, there's a large number of them in certain districts in Sheffield. We had a discussion in Sheffield Council as to whether or not we should consider them heritage assets, because they date to a very specific period, post-war housing shortages and innovation in design, council-led approach to trying to get people moved out of the slums of the inner city and into much nicer housing. The ultimate decision here was that looking at them in the context of national research, was to say that individually, we don't think we could say an individual area house is a heritage asset, but an entire estate of them at that scale, they do become a heritage asset, not something we would necessarily locally list or see serve to protect strongly, because the main problem here is that these buildings were falling apart due to their structural issues. So it was just more of a point of recognition that these have a value, and ensuring that a record was made that captured the importance of these buildings for the community and the area. Archaeology. So this obviously might require a different type of input. You might need a desk-based assessment to understand the potential of a place. You might need a field evaluation to investigate that in further depth. Or you might need a building appraisal to go and look at the actual establish the archaeological interest of a building by looking at it in more depth than you would from the street or historic maps alone. The other question is, does it contribute towards regional research objectives? And in South Yorkshire, we have one, the South Yorkshire Historic Environment Research Framework, which we use to justify why we think something might have research interest. So in South Yorkshire, as I say, it's public nominations. So we have a website for the front public facing side of things where they can see a map of all assets. There's a blog which I periodically update when I have time to say that things have been added. And we've got how-to guides. And then the actual application form is all online, so people can fill in information and send it to us. The level of information we get, obviously, you could imagine, varies depending on the expertise of the person putting forward the nomination. There's often quite a lot of legwork at our end to actually try and understand what the actual significance of this thing is. They may just provide us with a date and a historic association, and then we need to dig in more to establish the history of it and its architectural value and its archaeological interest, which is all very time consuming. So it wouldn't be possible to run this project without having some officer time involved. Our process, so once we've had this public nomination, and I mean, I said this was bottom up, and this table is top down, isn't it? So I should invert it next time I do this talk. But anyway, from top down, we have public nominations. We then review them and ensure that it presents as much information as we possibly can. We want to give it as good a chance at getting through this process as possible. We then batch them up and we put them out for public comment. So we advertise them on our website and we contact local amenity groups and anyone who's put in applications to try and get people engaged to provide additional information if it's available. Once we've got through that phase, we then batch them up. We take those batches to a panel. The panel's made up of local heritage experts, so people from amenity groups or specialist interest groups like Victorian Society or local conservation groups, people who have a invested and demonstrable interest and expertise in local heritage. And in fact, it is open to professionals. So if there are people here who are interested in this and being involved, then all you have to do is reach out to us and say, I'm interested, and we can have a conversation and work out what your interest is and where your expertise is and see if we can get you involved. Then we have a second phase of consultation where we put it out to owners. And we approach them at this point rather than earlier directly, because we want to approach them when we know that the recommendation is, the building is eligible. That is, it's ticked the boxes, it could be locally listed, rather than approaching some people before we've gone through that process, because it obviously people can have concerns about what does this mean about what I can do with my building or my site or whatever. So it makes much more sense to contact people at the point at which you know that you could actually locally list it. If they have a heritage objection, we might take it back to the panel. If there isn't any objection, then it goes then to the local planning authority, who then formally adopt it. And that is the stage at which it's sort of been legally adopted as far as the council's concerned. And then where we are in South Yorkshire it's an ongoing process, and we've been going at it now for 3-4 years, and it's quite, we managed to get through about, I don't know, 30 to 40 nominations each sort of third of the year. So it's slow, but we get there. But I think we're doing quite well, 363 entries so far. And you can see the breakdown there of the different types that people put in, obviously predominantly buildings. So I'll give some examples here of these. So obviously we get what I would term your sort of traditional designatable structures, you know, the public buildings, the ecclesiastic buildings, the sort of high visibility community assets like public houses. But then we also get things which are perhaps, the other things, war memorials. Nearly all of those will probably move on from local listing to national listing. Some people use local listing as a springboard to get their information straight, and then Historic England pick up on it and then take it on to national listing. But other things like boundary stones and troughs, horse troughs, we've got a few of those in Grenoside. And then the more contentious, this is probably our most modern building on the local list, the former National Centre for Popular Music in Sheffield, made to look like, well, I mean, I think earbuds, but the museum itself was constructed around the millennium. It failed as a museum and became Hallam University's union, but the buildings are very iconic. And it was quite a big discussion about what they actually mean in terms of the historic interest. And they really related here to the fact that this was Sheffield post-war trying to find a new identity which didn't just revolve around steel. So it's this whole sort of civic thing going on, which resulted in the construction of this building, which is actually architecturally very interesting and has a great story about it. And in the end, it was decided it was worthy of being considered a non-designated heritage asset. Parks and gardens, obviously cemeteries, very clear interest there. Smaller gardens. So this one, I haven't got a modern picture, but this shows it in its the old photo of what is now behind the Tapton Road Library, which was a private garden originally, but survives much the same as it does in this image, and has decided that private garden is of value. Areas, certainly in Sheffield, we've got whole valleys which are almost dedicated to water power, and they are now parks, and they have large amounts of remains of water power infrastructure there, and those, some people say, would be eligible potentially for consideration as World Heritage Site status because of the importance that water power had in the development of the steel industry in Sheffield, which then obviously grew to be international in fame. So they are really important, and local listing has been a really great exercise for getting local groups involved in researching and drawing that information together. Housing estates, we've got the Flower Estate in Sheffield. It's one of the very first council housing estates. Some of the houses were designed as part of an architectural competition, and this is all around 1910, so when it was started to be built, and the estate still survives very well, although obviously you expect, as you can expect seeing from that modern picture, UPVC windows, drives, and other forms of degraded work. But it's hoped that through local listing we might be able to recognise the positive qualities and see some enhancement over time. Below ground structures, obviously the actual buried remains. Here's a nice furnace which has been locally listed, now actually exists beneath a building because it was preserved in situ. Concrete structures, an RAF Norton bomb store. And then also buildings beneath the ground. So this is a encapsulated 18th century bridge underneath a 20th century bridge now, but it's only through there being some very keen members of the public who like to walk up and down through all the tunnels and culverted rivers of Sheffield that we find out about these things still surviving in situ. But interesting. So I think I'm doing all right for time. So I'll go through some policy background. So what do we do with non-designated heritage assets? How do they fit into the planning process? So we have these key things for local authorities to consider: the desirability of sustaining and enhancing, considering their positive contribution of heritage assets and what they may contribute towards local character. And then once we've done that exercise, it's then weighing that value against the impact and the benefit of the development. So in weight terms, and this is probably the most specific to South Yorkshire in the slides I've got, because the weightings of local lists will differ depending on how people put things on. In South Yorkshire, we to be locally listed, we say something has to meet 5 of the 7 criteria that we went through before. There are other local lists which have a lower bar. So as we all know, heritage assets exist on the spectrum. So just because something doesn't reach the bar for local listing in an area may not necessarily mean it's not a non-designated heritage asset, because the question is, does it have a degree of heritage significance meriting consideration in planning decisions? So what is the function in South Yorkshire then of a local list? Well, it's to help us give weight, in that we may say that at the lower end of the spectrum that there is negligible to local significance of these assets. And then we say once it reaches the bar for local listing, or can be shown to reach that bar, then we're saying that it's regionally significant. And obviously that adds more weight. That means that these are the best of our non-designated heritage assets. Obviously, in some circumstances, they may actually be eligible for national listing. And obviously that can be carried out through spot listing, emerging listing powers, or through the NPPF in relation to archaeological sites. If they're demonstrably of equal value to a scheduled monument, then they need to be treated as a scheduled monument. So the weight can then obviously go from being regional to having that special weight that you get from national significance. In planning terms, so this is how it moves through, and this is a very boring slide. I'll try to make it interesting by adding some little call outs. So we identify a heritage asset. It's been put through the local list, or it's on a conservation area appraisal, or it's been identified by someone in the council or by a consultee. We then ensure that significance is understood by doing the appropriate assessments. We then design the mitigation and to try and reduce harm where possible, taking into consideration the values that it has and its positive values. Then any remaining harm then gets weighed against the achieving the public benefit of the development and its optimum viable use. And then any remaining harm we attempt to mitigate or offset through further design details or recording. So the other aspect that we're considering in South Yorkshire, and has been put into implemented in, I think, Leicester and Blackpool and some other places already, is actually putting Article 4 directions, issuing Article 4 directions on locally listed buildings. And this Article 4 directions are something that remove permitted development rights. And there is a permitted development right for demolition of buildings, and except where they're in conservation areas. And that means that you can just put in a prior notification to the council to say, I'm going to demolish my building completely safely. It doesn't have to go through any oversight in terms of planning balance, and you can then knock it down. So heritage, non-designated heritage assets are very highly at risk. And there's fear from some quarters that by local listing, you put a target on them, people then may attempt to knock them down. There's ways of putting immediate Article 4s to prevent demolition, but it really then relies on the local authority being very active and mobile and being able to move fast to get something done, which with the current funding situation is quite difficult. So the theory is that if we can get council committee approval for having Article 4s issued, then we can get ahead of that and then get to a point where these non-designated heritage assets are at least given this consideration of being weighed appropriately in a planning balance. I'm looking at my time. I think I've raced through that, so I'm going to do my examples. And these, I'm afraid, I have kind of taken from other things. So they're kind of, last time I gave these talks, I was about industrial sites. So we've got some industrial examples for us. But this is interesting because this tells a story. When it came to us through the local list, we're like, well, I can see it's a historic building, it's heavily altered, but what is going on with it? Well, originally it's an 18th century farmstead built on a courtyard plan, but it was converted in the around about 1800 into linen working cottages. So this was a very specific industry in Barnsley area. So we know about the cotton industry, obviously huge on the other side of the Pennines in Manchester and towards Leeds. But in this region, it was linen. And the industry grew to the point where people saw that it was now viable, rather than having it as an addition to your agricultural business, actually converting farms to just be linen works. What was interesting about these places was that linen working took place in the basement. It's damper down there, and the flax in the linen when it dries, it's more likely to break. So you want to work on it in a damp setting. They had earth floors. People would stay down there for full working day, probably longer than a modern working day, and obviously not a great place for your health, although the best working condition for the fabric. This sort of thing was going on up until the mid, probably like the pre-1910s, 1920s, and this is the last loom worker in Barnsley working on his loom frame in a basement. But so he told an important story, heavily altered structure, but important history and some really interesting archaeology going on in there. Then we look at some landscapes, so ironstone mining. So lidar was a fantastic arrival for South Yorkshire because we knew these things were in our woods. They really revealed the extent of them because they're everywhere. They form a huge band on the Tankersley Iron Seam, and these were exploited from the medieval period right up until the 19th century. These mounds or annulus spoil heaps, or some relate to bell pits. And you can see in that section there how they're excavated. You just dig down and dig out as far as is safe. Your spoil from one, as you're digging out one, is used to backfill another. Over time, that then sumps and you get this sort of distinctive donut shape. As you know, they didn't know really what to do with the land afterwards. They're nearly always converted to woodland, which obviously supported the production of charcoal and other wood for other industrial functions. So there is a real distinctive industrial landscape feature. Another one, wagonways. And if you're walking along tracks and you find these evenly spaced stone slabs, then there's a reconstructed example from Silkstone. These are early railways. So these are the means by which people were transporting goods. Here in the bottom there is from Chapeltown, but it's the same technology. These are horse-drawn wagons being pulled up and down along these L-shaped iron rails. The one in here we have in Silkstone from the map, you can see this was started out from the Barnby Basin Canal and then extended the canal essentially up into the foothills and the areas where the mining was going on. Incidentally, where it says low mill furnace, there's a wood, that wood, Hogsett wood, is absolutely filled with bell pits as well. This is a very key industrial landscape operated by the Spencer Stanhope family, who had Cannon Hall in Cawthorne, which is now a public museum. And then finally, my favourite really is yellow bins. Are they a heritage asset? Well, they're locally listed in Sheffield. Well, this one is locally listed now. They were designed by David Mellor, who is probably most well known for having designed the traffic lights we see every day. He was very key, involved, I think probably whatever was the equivalent of Highways England at the time, in designing street furniture in a modernist design. These bins were everywhere in Sheffield during the post-war period, where you can see these images showing Sheffield evolving into a modernist town with the high-rise flats and that car park there. But the bins hold a very sentimental very sentimental value to people who grew up in the city in that time. They were highly distinctive because of their colour. They have a very good high quality design, and we know who the designer is. They're very rare now because we've only got one left. And they have historic and community interest. Here's the Appreciation Society with its 400 members, probably pretty tongue-in-cheek. There certainly isn't any other branch than the Sheffield branch, but it just goes to show how the heritage, everyday heritage, can warrant our consideration as being our best non-designated heritage asset, even when it's just a bin. So that's it really. Hopefully that's sparked some ideas and provides you with some information. I look forward to hearing some of your questions.